So this is now part two of the lecture. So we talked last time about an incident that occurred in Antelope Canyon, and the um, the company that had led the participants through the canyon ended up, rather than going to court, settling out of court. But when these events occur, you really want to think about how do you minimize your risk, but how do you do things so that there's still the excitement or the um, what people see in outdoor recreation activities so they don't totally disappear. So, what is risk management? Well, these are policies, practices, procedures that you use to protect, perhaps reduce or address potential injuries or financial losses. So, as we noted before, risk is an essential element, particularly of outdoor recreation, but of other items too. There's growth occurs when you take risks. So we don't want to totally eliminate risk, we want to manage it. So that's why we call it risk management. So here's the risk assessment matrix. We're actually going to deal with a somewhat simpler one, but I want to start with this one. Two very key elements: the likelihood that something occurs, probability. So in this case, they break it down into three: 0 to 33%, 33 to 66%, or very likely to occur. So, when you say walk down the street, how likely is it to occur that you're going to trip? Well, it's very unlikely, but it is possible. So we'd say that's right there. Let's say you were to ride your bike down a hill and go, I'm going to show I can do this without using hands. Well, unless you're pretty good, you're probably somewhere over here. Probability of something occurring. Well, the other item is, what is that? What is the consequence of this occurring? Well, if you're walking down the street and you're fairly young and, well, if you trip, yeah, you might scrape yourself up. You're probably unlikely to break a bone. So maybe the consequence is kind of between minor and moderate. But, riding your bike down a hill with showing you can do it without your hands, well, there's, I don't know, somewhere up here. You're probably not going to die if you crash, but you may get hurt pretty badly. Well, let's think about rock climbing. Well, the consequences are really high, leading up to death, possibly. So there could be major consequences. So if you're rock climbing and there's a possibility of um, major injury and so forth, you really have to manage in a way that you're not having a high probability of this happening. You need to make a major event very unlikely to occur. That's why you use ropes. You don't send people on climbs they're not able to do. So what we try to do, say, an activity like rock climbing is, yes, something could happen, but we're going to do everything we can in terms of equipment, training, and so forth, so that it's unlikely to occur. Now, the possibility, let's say we're going backpacking. I know several of the students have done that. That's when you go into the wilderness carrying a backpack with your tent and so forth. And it's not a very hazardous activity, but certainly you could fall, you could injure your knee. So maybe minor or moderate uh, consequence, but it's not that likely to occur. So, maybe you're right here. So when you go backpacking, yes, you take some precautions, but you don't need to take the precautions you do when you rock climb. So the reality is what you're trying to avoid is being up here. You don't want to be high or extreme unless, you're doing something very specialized. So if there's a major consequence, you need to lower the probability of it occurring. If the minor consequence of something happening, say a scraped up leg or something like that, it's not as important that you manage that to make it unlikely to occur. It's not as big a deal. So you're actually okay over here, although maybe you'd rather be kind of a little bit closer to this square. So that's really the risk assessment matrix. If something's if there's a terrible outcome, you want to make it so it's very unlikely to occur. And this is, you're actually going to work with this particular graph on your assignment, but this is just showing how this is simplifying the graph into a 2x2 matrix, probability consequence. And what's this basically showing is if you're up here where there's consequences are really high, meaning someone gets badly injured and it's a high probability, you need to do something with that program to move it over into this square, or perhaps even down to here. If you were to reduce the either reduce the likelihood of the injury being bad or reduce the probability of it occurring. So you'll work with that on the assignment. And with the assignment, I'm going to have you think about, and this is actually, the university has begun to manage this issue in the last year, and that's the scooters on campus. There's been several times I've been on campus and someone came zooming by me on these scooters. So I want you to think of what is the risk, identify the risk that's associated with this activity. What are your various ways you could deal with it? You can even look into what this university did if you want. You can do some research there. But I want you to think of a few different ways that you could respond to this particular activity. And then third, how would you implement that change to lower the risk? So that's what the second part of the assignment will be. So what are some ways you can reduce the risk? Well, you can get rid of the program. In the case of the scooters, you could say no scooters. You can't ride the scooters. The risk is gone. Another way is insurance. Well, if something happens, at least we'll have an insurer pay for it. That's called transferring. You're transferring the financial risk to another organization. Now they're going to say, well, if we're going to take on this risk, this is the way you're going to have to behave. They're going to give you guidelines on what's appropriate. There's retention, which means you just assume, okay, if something happens, we'll just pay ourselves. And actually, that's what public agencies often do, because they can't, especially the state of California, really can't get insurance. It's too big. And the other option is reduction. How do you allow these activities in a safe manner? So those are 4 ways to potentially reduce risk. What are other things you can do? Well, reporting and record keeping, keep track of when accidents occur, and that allows you to make a strategy to address them. Inspect facilities. If you're doing a outdoor recreation trip or some type of, well, really any activity, at the beginning of the activity, you need to explain how it's done in a safe manner. That's called a briefing. How important you train the staff, that's key. Have an emergency action plan, emergency procedures, and then of course carry insurance and have participants sign waivers. None of these are fail-safe, but at least they do reduce your risk. You're reducing the likelihood of something really bad occurring. So in terms of a risk management plan, and I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but from America Outdoors, what they say, yeah, it's great to have a risk management plan, but one problem with it is that if you do go to court, your risk management plan will likely be called into discovery, meaning that both the plaintiffs and defendants will be looking at it. And if it shows that you knew a certain activity was risky or you knew something might occur, well, that's potentially, that could make you liable. So be very careful. Keep it general. You certainly want a risk management plan, but you also don't want it so specific. And if that particular thing happens, they'll go, well, gosh, you knew that this was a possibility. You knew that somebody could fall out of the boat and hit a rock. Why didn't you better plan for it?